Crusaders versus Turks, 1101 AD, the Battle of Mersivan, the crusade that never returned. This is the story of an army that marched into Anatolia believing heaven had cleared the road, and vanished into a landscape that seemed to swallow men whole. Picture the dust of midsummer Asia Minor. The sun is a hard coin in a white sky, and the horizon wavers like water. Thousands of pilgrim-stone soldiers stretch along a narrow track, their armor hot enough to burn skin, their mouths cracked from thirst. They are not the famous princes of the First Crusade. These are the latecomers, the survivors of old vows. They're desperate and they're ambitious, following the same cross eastward because Europe has promised them miracles and land. Behind them, trail wagons packed with women, children, priests, and relics. It is a moving city of faith, and it is already running out of food. Here is the first hard fact that should make you uneasy. This crusade set out in 3 great armies, tens of thousands strong. Within weeks of entering Turkish territory, nearly all of them would be destroyed. They do not know that yet. They do not know that every ridge hides eyes, that every dry riverbed is a trap, that a quiet wind can carry the sound of hooves. Somewhere ahead, on ground they cannot see, a net is being tightened. The Crusaders think they are marching toward glory. But what if they are walking into a grave that has been waiting for them since the moment they left home? The second tide of the cross. 2 summers had barely passed since Jerusalem fell to the first wave of Crusaders. In Europe, the bells that had rung for victory were still echoing in the minds of men who had not been there. The news had traveled like fire through courts and villages, through monasteries and marketplaces. It did not arrive as a careful chronicle. It arrived as a thunderclap. The holy city was taken. The tomb was free. The cross had triumphed in the east. But victory is a magnet. It pulls the hopeful and the hungry. It pulls sons who miss their chancellors who smelled future kingdoms, and pilgrims who believed that if God had opened Jerusalem once, he would open it again for anyone brave enough to go. In 1101, that hunger became a second tide, not 1 crusade, but 3, swelling separately across the continent like 3 storm clouds that would meet in the same sky. You have to understand who these new crusaders were. The First Crusade had been led by princes who fought like wolves and negotiated like kings. They were brutal, yes, but they were disciplined by necessity. They learned to starve, to march, to hold formation under arrows. The new armies of 1101 were different. Many were armed pilgrims, not hardened veterans. They carried icons and family heirlooms beside spears. They marched with wives and children because they truly believed they were going to settle in the Holy Land, not merely fight for it. Their faith was real, but their experience was thin. They were a caravan of hope wearing the shape of an army. One host gathered around Lombard leaders in northern Italy, a mass of foot soldiers so large it moved like a flood. Another formed under French nobles, seasoned knights and lesser lords who came partly for God and partly for land. A third followed men from Aquitaine and Bavaria. Different tongues, different banners, different ambitions. The only thread tying them together was the promise of the road, Constantinople, then Anatolia, then Syria, then Jerusalem, a line drawn on parchment by priests and princes who had survived the First Crusade's ordeal. Byzantium stood at the gate of that road. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos had watched the First Crusade with a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because the Latins had helped push the Turks back from western Anatolia. Dread because those same Latins were unpredictable, hungry, and had carved their own states in the east. Now, in 1101, a new Latin tide was rolling toward his capital, larger than many invasions he had faced. Constantinople in those days was a city like a jeweled fortress at the edge of worlds. Its walls were the color of old bone, miles long, bristling with towers. Inside, domes of gold caught the sunlight. Markets churned with silk, incense, fish, and murmured languages. When the first Crusaders arrived, they had been awed. When the second wave came, they were impatient. The Lombards reached the empire first, and their arrival was less like an embassy and more like a migration. They spilled into Byzantine territory with little restraint, buying what they could, taking what they could not. Local villages shuttered, fields were stripped. Alek had seen this behavior before. He knew a hungry crusade could be as dangerous as a Turkish raid. He met their leaders with caution, offered supplies, and promised ships and guides, but only if they swore the same oath the first princes had sworn. that any land taken once belonging to Byzantium would be returned. Some swore easily, some with clenched teeth, some not at all. The bitterness between Greeks and Latins was already a living thing. It breathed in rumor and insult. Too many Crusaders, the Byzantines were soft, too clever, too Eastern. To the Byzantines, the Crusaders were a moving catastrophe wrapped in sanctity, yet Alexios still needed them. The Turks were not gone from Anatolia. They were watching, waiting, and they had learned from the last war. While the Lombards bickered and feasted, the French contingents arrived and tried to bring order. There were famous names among them, men with reputations sharpened by the First Crusade. Their presence gave the whole enterprise a spine. For a moment it looked as if this second tide might be more than a reckless pilgrimage. For a moment, Alexios believed he could steer them away from disaster. He insisted on a plan. The safest road to the Holy Land, he told them, ran south along the coast, where Byzantine forts still stood, and supplies could be moved by sea. It was the road the First Crusaders finally learned to respect, but the Lombards wanted something else. They had heard of Bohemond of Antioch, a hero to the west, a threat to Byzantium, captured by the Danishmend Turks and held somewhere in the interior. To them, rescuing Bohemond was both noble and profitable. He was a symbol. Free him, and you free a legend. Free him, and perhaps you gain a leader who could carve you a kingdom, Alexios warned them. The interior was not a road. It was a furnace. It was a country of empty plains and sudden mountains, of Turkish riders who moved faster than any Latin column, and of towns that could vanish behind closed gates. But warnings collide with certainty when certainty is powered by faith. The Lombards insisted. The French argued. The Germans hesitated. The Crusade chose the interior. That decision was the first invisible cut. You do not feel the blade at once. Only later do you see how deeply it went. In late spring, the crusading masses were ferried across the Bosporus into Asia. The strait was narrow, almost gentle, but crossing it felt like stepping into another world. Behind them lay the Christian empire that still smelled of bread and gardens. Ahead lay Anatolia, ruled by Seljuks and Danishmends, where the grass grew sparse, and every hill belonged to someone who knew how to fight on horseback. They marched, east with banners high, a shaggy forest of crosses, lions, eagles, and saints. The knights rode on the flanks, helmets gleaming. The foot soldiers trudged in the center with pack animals and wagons. Priests walked among them chanting prayers for victory. At night, campfires dotted the plains like fallen stars, and the sound of hymns drifted over the dark. But the land did not answer their hymns. It answered with silence and with heat. Soon the first signs appeared, small enough to ignore if you wanted to believe. Wells that should have been full were dry. Villages on the map were half-empty ruins. Herds had been driven away. Fields burned. The Turks were not confronting them head-on. They were draining the world around them, turning the Crusades' path into a corridor of thirst. Scouts began to vanish. A man would ride out in the morning with 3 companions, and return at dusk alone, pale, saying nothing for a long time. Arrows appeared in the sand near the columns, planted like warnings. Sometimes a rider was glimpsed on a ridge at sunset, then gone. The Crusaders told themselves the enemy was afraid. After all, they were many, and they were holy. Yet fear does not always run from numbers, sometimes it circles them. They reached Nicaea's hinterlands and headed toward the plateau. The march lengthened. The army stretched out for miles. When a column stretches, it becomes a creature with a long spine and slow reflexes. The knights could not be everywhere. The foot soldiers plodded forward, clutching prayer beads and spears, unable to see who was behind them, unable to know what was happening ahead. Then came the first real blow. Near the ruins of an old settlement, Turkish horsemen struck like a desert squall. They did not charge into the center. They harassed the edges, firing arrows into the columns, then retreating before heavy cavalry could catch them. The Crusaders, furious, pursued in scattered knots. They rode hard after shadows, and the shadows led them into gullies and scrub where more arrows waited. They returned bleeding, frantic, and with fewer men than they had started with. The French nobles tried to restore discipline. They ordered tighter marching formations, more guards for the wagons, and a stronger vanguard. But discipline is a plant that needs water, and water was becoming the rarest currency in the army. Each day that wells failed, each day that Turkish riders cut them off from streams, the plant withered. Still they pressed on. The promise of Bormann's rescue pulled at them like a chain. The hope of Jerusalem glittered in their minds like a mirage. Every hardship could be made sacred if you believed the end justified the suffering. You can feel the story leaning toward its first payoff here, because the Crusaders are not alone in this march. Across the plateau, two Turkish powers are watching them with a clarity Europe never imagined. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, bruised by previous defeats, wants revenge. The Danishmends, fierce lords of the north, want to protect their own realm and keep Bohemond in chains. They are rivals, but this Latin tide is large enough to unite them. In their councils, the Turks do not see a holy army. They see a slow beast, heavy with baggage, softened by certainty, and they decide to kill it with patience. By early summer, the Crusaders approached the region around Ankara. The city, once a Byzantine bastion, was now a prize bitterly contested. The Crusaders expected to take it quickly and refill their stores, but they found it already hardened against them, and the Turks around it like smoke. A siege began, clumsy and desperate. The Crusaders built engines from greenwood. They dug where the ground was too hard. They prayed louder with every failed assault. Then, as suddenly as a door slammed in a storm, Ankara fell not by Latin genius, but because its Turkish garrison fled at night, melting away into the hills. The Crusaders surged into the city, cheering. They found food, yes. They found wells, yes. For a single brief window, they tasted the sweetness of survival. Roads of hunger and fire. Dawn came without mercy. The river beside the camp had dropped again overnight, as if the earth had been drinking from it in secret. Men knelt in the mud, cupping what they could, while horses shoved their muzzles into the shallows and snorted in frustration. The day had barely begun, and already the Crusade felt the slow grip of thirst tightening around its throat. They marched anyway. The column moved out in a long, uneven serpent, banners snapping in a wind that carried no coolness. Past the first ridge, the world opened into a high, empty plateau. Far-off hills rose in dull waves, and between them lay corridors of scrub and dust. There were no towns, no orchards, no shade. Each hour on that road felt like a wager struck with a god who no longer listened. But first, the silence seemed like a blessing. No arrows hissed, no riders showed themselves. The Crusaders told each other the Turks were falling back again, retreating into the wild after Ankara. Some laughed at their own fear from the night before. Some sang to make the march feel lighter. It was a dangerous kind of relief. It made them look only forward. Near midday, the vanguard found a village or something. That had once been a village. Its houses were black shells. Roofs had collapsed inward. The air smelled faintly of ash, old and stale. A small stone church stood without a door, its altar smashed, its walls scrawled with soot. The Crusaders spread through the ruins in a rush of hunger, hoping for grain, wells, anything, but found only empty jars and dead hearths. The Turks had not just stripped supplies, they had erased life. The Lombard foot soldiers cursed. The French knights grew quiet. Priests murmured prayers of trial and endurance, but even their voices sounded thin in that burnt place. A few men stared at the church wall as if waiting for it to explain why God's road was paved with ashes. Then a horn sounded from the rear short. Sharp, wrong. The first wave of panic came from behind, rolling forward like smoke. People began to run along the column, shouting that Turks had fallen on the wagons. Knights spurred back, lances lowering, expecting a fight that would redeem the morning's boredom. When they reached the rear, they found not a battle line but a storm. The Turkish riders were everywhere and nowhere, swarming the edges of the baggage train, loosing arrows into the packed mass of pilgrims. Each time the knights tried to form for a charge, the Turks slid away, splitting like water around stone, only to dart back in from another angle. A wagon shrieked as it toppled, its oxen slashed, children tumbling into dust. A priest went down with an arrow in his throat, clutching a cross that now looked less like a promise and more like a weight dragging him toward the ground. The knights did what knights always did. They chased a handful spilled after the fleeing riders into a shallow valley. The pursuit felt righteous, almost comforting. Steel against horsemen who would not stand still. But the valley narrowed, and scrub rose on both sides. The Turks led them just far enough, then veered apart. From the slopes came the real rain of arrows, dense and close. Horses screamed and stumbled. A French count lurched in his saddle as a shaft punched through his mail at the armpit. Another knight tried to turn back and found the exit crowded with fallen mounds. The valley became a choke point of panicked animals and men. who suddenly understood they had chased bait. Those who survived crawled out hours later, dazed, without knowing how many they had lost. The column moved on with fewer knights, fewer horses, fewer wagons, and with more fear. That night the leaders held council in a ring of flickering lamps. The Lombard chiefs wanted revenge, swore that the Turks would be crushed in open battle if only they could be brought to stand. The French argued for tightening the march, for forcing the rear and vanguard closer. The Germans, their faces lined by heat and doubt, urged a turn south toward safer ground, back toward the coastal route. But every suggestion to retreat was met with the same quiet accusation. If you turn back now, what was the vow worth? What would you tell the men who had left home believing this march was ordained? So the crusade continued east, and the argument inside it continued with them, invisible but growing. Days passed in a blur of thirst and harassment. The Turks never offered a single decisive engagement. They bled the crusade slowly, always choosing when and where. At sunrise, a cloud of riders would appear in the distance, a shimmer of movement, not close enough to hit, just close enough to be seen. The Crusaders would mutter, clench, march faster. By noon, arrows would hiss in from a line of hills, then stop. By evening, another skirmish would flare at the rear. Sleep became a thing done with one eye open. Every loss carried two wounds: the body that fell, and the confidence that fell with it. The pilgrims were the first to change. They stopped singing. They began to walk in silence as if sound might draw arrows. Mothers made their children keep cloth over their mouths to save spit. Old men who had once spoken of reaching Jerusalem asked quietly for water, then asked no more. The army's center became heavier, slower, more fragile with each day. Yet the Turks were not the only threat. Hunger is a rival commander, and it is ruthless as food thinned. Discipline thinned with it. Men drifted out of formation to search for hidden wells or stray goats. Some returned with nothing. Some never returned. Others came back dragging half-rotted carcasses, eating meat that made them sick, but still kept them marching. A French knight was found in the dark cutting open a dead horse's belly, boiling strips of flesh over a fire, his hands shaking from shame and need. No one spoke of it aloud. Everyone understood. One afternoon the Crusaders reached a narrow pass where the track ran between rocky shoulders. It should have felt like safety, like a corridor narrowing toward their goal. Instead it felt like a throat about to close. The vanguard entered first. The middle followed, though rear lagged, as always, burdened by wagons. For a long minute nothing happened. Then stones began to tumble down the slopes, not as a natural fall but as a deliberate avalanche. They crashed onto the track, splitting, oxen snapping wheels, pinning men, and from above came arrows again, not scattered shots, but a black swarm. The pass became a killing shoot. Crusaders tried to climb the rocks and found the slopes too steep under fire. Knights crowded in the bottleneck, unable to wheel. Foot soldiers pressed forward, only to collide with the wrecked wagons. The screams were not heroic. They were animal, raw, scraping at the inside of God's silence. Then, just as panic threatened to crack the column in half, a countercharge formed. The French nobles, white-faced but furious, pushed their men up one slope in a scrambling surge. Lances were useless there, but swords were not. They hacked and staggered upward, slipping on gravel and blood, until they reached the crest and found Turkish archers already mounting to retreat. The knights caught a few, cut them down, and the rest vanished over the ridge. It was a scrap of victory. It felt like breath returning. Men shouted. Some raised their swords to the sky. For a heartbeat the crusade believed again in its own strength. But victory in a trap is often part of the trap. By sunset the pass was behind them, yet the cost was clear. The baggage train lay in pieces. The road was littered with bodies and smashed casks. Worst of all, the water skins taken by the Turks would not be replaced. The crusade had survived the day, but tomorrow would be thirstier. At night, as they camped on open ground, the Turks did not attack. Instead they waited, in the dark slopes around them, setting small fires that flickered like a ring of distant eyes. The Crusaders could see them, and that was the point. Some men stared at those fires until their own vision blurred. Others tried to sleep and could not. The feeling of being watched seeped into every breath. Near midnight a rumor moved through the camp, soft as a blade. The Turks were gathering, not just raiders now, but an army, a real one. Something big enough to end this wandering war in a single blow. The leaders dismissed the rumor in public. In private, Bayless had scouts sent out before dawn came back with news that chilled even the boldest. Tracks, thousands of them. Fresh dung. Ears of grain scattered as if dropped by careless hands. The signs of cavalry moving fast and in numbers. The enemy was no longer a shadow. It was a storm front. Still, the Crusaders saw no wall of men on the horizon. Only open country, only the road forward, only the same quiet hill. The absence gnawed at them more than a visible threat would have. If the Turks were gathering, where would they strike? And why had they waited this long? By late afternoon, the answer began to take shape. Ahead lay a wide basin of grass and low scrub, bordered by wooded ridges. A place where a large camp could rest. A place with enough space to form battle lines. The guides, nervous Byzantines who had long stopped pretending confidence, named it quietly Mersivan. The word meant nothing to most Crusaders. They saw only the promise of a flatter night's rest. They did not notice how the ridges curved, like ants around the basin. They did not ask why the Turks had allowed them to reach such a place intact. The trap at Mersivan. Morning did not arrive with birdsong. It arrived with hooves. Before the sun cleared the ridges, a shiver ran through the camp, the kind that moves faster than any messenger. Men sat up, squinting into the grey. Horses stamped and tugged at their tethers. Somewhere a watchman shouted, and the shout was swallowed by a rising roar, deep and rolling, like thunder unfolding behind a curtain. Then the ridges came alive. Lines of Turkish riders crested the hills in every direction. Not scattered raiders now, but ordered bands with banners snapping above them. Their horses were small, hard, and fresh. Their bows were already bent. The first arrows came down into the camp like a sudden black sleet, rattling off shields, thudding into canvas, punching into flesh before men could find their helms. The Crusaders had expected battle. They had not expected it to begin inside their breakfast fires. Panic tried to take the camp in one gulp. Pilgrims ran first, clutching children, stumbling between tents. Wagons lurched as oxen bellowed under arrow wounds. Knights shouted commands that tangled with each other in the smoke. Priests lifted relics into the air, crying for courage, while men around them died with empty hands. But fear does not always win at the first strike. The French nobles forced a line into being. They dragged the fighters out of the chaos, formed a shield wall between the camp and the nearest slope, and drove their lances into the ground to anchor the front. Lombard foot soldiers, furious at the loss of their wagons, crowded the line and braced spears. Germans fell in beside them. For a moment, the crusade became an army again. The Turkish riders did not charge that line. They flowed around it. Arrows kept coming, but the horsemen were already shifting to the flanks, seeking open gaps between tents, between wagons, between clusters of terrified non-combatants. They struck where the Crusaders were softest, then peeled away. A Danishman captain rode close enough for Crusaders to see the red silk at his lance, smiled, and turned aside as if to say, "You cannot catch smoke." The knights tried anyway. A band of heavily armored Frenchmen spurred forward in a tight knot, lowering lances toward a retreating screen of archers. The ground was open here, and the charge looked like the old songs for a heartbeat. But the Turks did not run in a straight line. They split, veered, and drew the charge farther from the main camp. The knights gained speed. Their horses foamed. Their breath grew loud inside their helms, and then the Turks vanished over a low rise. When the knights followed, they did not find a fleeing enemy. They found a waiting one. A sudden wall of riders swung in from both sides, letting fly at point-blank range. Arrows punched into horse necks and visors. The charge collapsed into a knot of screaming animals and men who could not lift their shields fast enough. A few armored figures staggered back toward the camp on foot, leaving a trail of blood in the grass. Most did not come back at all. Word of that slaughter reached the camp quickly. It did something worse than kill, but it killed the instinct to pursue. After that, every time Turkish riders retreated, Crusaders held their ground, aching to chase but terrified of what lay beyond the next fold of earth. The battle settled into a rhythm that favored the Turks. They were not trying to break the crusade. With one blow, they were slicing it, slowly, into pieces small enough to finish. By mid-morning, the sun was high, and the basin felt like a bowl of fire. Dust hung in the air so thick it made the world small. In that choking haze, the Crusader leaders tried to shift the camp into a fortified ring. They pulled wagons into rough barricades. They put the pilgrims in the center. They tightened their lines around the fuels and the river edge. It was a sensible plan, the kind of improvisation veterans cling to. It was also the plan the Turks had prepared for. From the north ridge came a heavy push. Danishment horsemen riding close, not loosing arrows but threatening a full charge. The Crusaders swung forces to meet them, shouting, bracing. The pressure grew. Everyone looked north. That was when the Seljuk riders struck the south. A second wave poured down from the opposite ridge. Swift, disciplined, and quiet. They did not waste arrows on shields. They aimed for oxen, for the legs of foot soldiers, for the cramped spaces where the pilgrims huddled. The barricade along the south buckled under sudden weight. A wagon went over, and through that gap the Seljuks streamed like water through a cracked dam. The camp broke in too. Crusaders spun in confusion, unable to decide which front mattered. The north assault eased for a breath, not retreat, just a pause, and that pause was poison. It made men think that danger had shifted south, that the north ridge was safe, that they could pull away. More were dragged to the southern panic, and the northern riders began to descend again, now closer, now with arrows flying. The basin became a trap, snapping shut from two jaws. There were small islands of courage inside the chaos. A Lombard priest planted a cross in the ground beside a wagon and rallied a circle of foot soldiers around it. They fought like cornered wolves, stabbing at horses, yanking riders down, dying to the last man with the cross still standing over them. On another flank, a German count formed a wedge of knights and punched into a Seljuk band, buying a moment of space for pilgrims to flee toward the river. Those moments mattered, but they were moments measured against a plan measured in hours. By afternoon, the Crusaders were no longer a single force. They were clusters, each fighting its own war, each blind to the others. Smoke from burning tents smeared the sky. The ground was slick with blood and churned into dust by hooves. The screams of animals outnumbered the screams of men. The Turkish Khmergas watched this carefully. They did not throw everything in at once. They fed the battle, tightening it, letting the Crusaders exhaust themselves against air. When a Crusader line stiffened, they pulled back and rained arrows. When it softened, they surged forward and cut it open. Every move was designed not just to win, but to make the enemy feel he was losing by his own hands. Late in the day, a rumor flashed through the Crusader ranks like lightning. The leaders were leaving. It began with a single sight: high nobles mounting fresh horses, gathering their personal guards. Then another saw it, then another. Some said it was a read. Some said it was a charge being prepared, but the men who watched those lords ride toward the western edge of the basin understood something without words. The men with the best armor, the best mounts, and the clearest paths were slipping away. A cry rose not of prayer, but of betrayal. The French and German nobles who remained tried to seal the breach in morale, shouting that new lines were forming, that the battle could still be turned. Yet the damage had already seeped in. If the great ones could flee, why should the common man stay? If salvation was possible on horseback, why die on foot? And as if the Turks sensed that moral fracture as clearly as scent, their pressure doubled. Riders swept close enough to show their faces, shouting in languages the Crusaders could half understand. Throw down your arms. Live. Some Crusaders did. They knelt, hands raised, and were bound. Others watched and hesitated. Hesitation on a battlefield as a door left open. The center began to collapse inward, near the river, where the pilgrims, crowded in desperate knots, the last Crusader line tried to hold. They fought around a tangle of wagons, shielding children, with their bodies swinging swords that grew heavier with every minute. Arrows hummed, horses darted in and out. The river was turning red at its edges. Then, without warning, the Danishman riders who had been harassing the north surged in for a kill, not into the barricade but around it, sealing the path west. The Crusaders looked up and saw the only open exit closing behind a wall of moving horses. It was a sight that hollowed the chest. They were ringed, not by stone, but by speed. Not by walls, but by a circle that could tighten whenever it chose. The sun tilted toward evening, and still the Turks pressed, calmer than any army had a right to be after hours of killing. Their horses were still fresh. Their arrows were still coming. Their order was intact. The Crusaders, gasping, realized the awful truth too late. Mersivan was not a battlefield they had stumbled into. It was a battlefield they had been delivered to. The ridges were not scenery. They were scaffolding for a trap laid days ago, and now night was coming. That should have been mercy, it was not. In the gathering dusk, the Turkish riders did something that felt almost gentle. They eased back to the ridges, just out of reach, leaving the basin littered with the wounded, the dying, the stunned. Their fires reappeared on the heights, a ring of stars not fallen this time, but watching. The Crusaders had no time to mourn. They had to decide what a broken army decides when. Darkness hides both salvation and slaughter. Stay inside the ruined camp and wait for morning's final blow, or try to break out in the night, through riders they could not see. Men looked to their leaders for an answer, but many leaders were already gone in the middle of the shattered camp. Under a sky turning purple, the remaining nobles gathered in a tight circle. Their faces were shadowed by soot and exhaustion. They spoke in low, urgent bursts. The decision they were about to make would decide whether anyone lived to see another dawn around them. The pilgrims listened, clutching children close eyes, reflecting the distant Turkish fires. The ring on the ridges did not move. It did not need to. It waited. An army that breaks that night in Mersivan was not dark. It was lit in pieces by the low, anxious fires of the Crusader camp below, and by the patient, encircling fires on the ridges above. Between those rings of flame lay a silence so taut it felt like a bowstring. The nobles met in the half-round center of the camp. Their armor was dented, their cloaks stiff with dust. Around them stood the remnants of their guards, men who had fought since dawn and now swayed on their feet like trees after a storm. They argued in short, bitter breaths. There was no good choice left, only degrees of ruin. Some wanted to hold the camp and face the morning. They said the Turks would be tired too. They said a solid line at dawn could still open a path west. Others shook their heads. They had seen the enemy's horses still fresh, the arrows still thick. They had felt the basin tighten. If they waited for sunrise, they would be waiting for a knife at the throat. The third voice, the one that grew louder as fear sharpened it, said to run now. While the night hid movement, break out in small groups. Save whoever could ride, let the rest follow as best they could. No one said the rest could not follow. But everyone heard it. At last the decision settled like ash. They would attempt to break out before midnight along the western edge, where the ground rose and the ridges seemed farther apart. The knights would lead, striking a hole through the Turkish ring. The foot soldiers and pilgrims would surge behind, them in a single desperate tide. If the gap held, they might live. If it closed, there would be no second try. The message went out quietly, rolling through the camp like a cold wind. Men tightened straps. Women wrapped children in blankets and tied them to their backs. Priests moved among the wounded, offering last rites in whispers, knowing many would not walk another mile. Horses were brought forward, the few that still stood. The river murmured nearby, red-black in firelight, as if ashamed to witness what it had been forced to carry. Somewhere on the ridge, a Turkish horn sounded once, low and long, and then it was silent again. Near midnight, the Crusaders began to move. At first it was orderly. Knights formed in rough columns, heads down, lances angled forward. Foot soldiers gathered behind them, a dense knot of bodies, clutching spears, tools, anything sharp. Wagons were abandoned. The camp that had been their fragile city became a graveyard of canvas and smoke. They advanced toward the west in a slow, careful push. The grass was wet with nighttime dew, and their steps were muffled. For a handful of heartbeats, it almost worked. The ridge ahead stayed dark. No arrows whistled. No riders surged down. The Crusaders began to believe the Turks had loosened the ring, or perhaps withdrawn to rest. Then the ground ahead erupted with movement. The Turkish ring had not loosened. It had lowered itself. Riders rose out of the darkness like wolves lifting from tall grass, their horses already at speed. The first volley struck the front ranks at 10 paces. Knights fell backward from their saddles without a sound. Horses crashed into men behind them. The column buckled before it could generate momentum. The Crusaders tried to push through anyway. They leaned into their shields and waded forward under arrows, screaming now. The knights stripped of stealth. Swords flashed. A few Turks were dragged down and killed in the crush. A gap opened for an instant. Men surged into it, and the Turks slid sideways and closed it again. The breakout became a slaughterhouse. The knights who had hoped to carve a path found their horses bleeding out under them. The foot soldiers, packed too tightly to flee or fight freely, were pinned by fear and bodies behind them. The pilgrims pressed forward in terror, not knowing the front had already collapsed. The mass became a tide with no channel, surging into its own ruin. A child's wail rose above the din. A woman fell and vanished under boots. A priest tried to lift a relic high to rally the crowd and took an arrow through the cheek. The relic slipped from his hand into the mud. Then something worse happened. The nobles in the front realized the breach could not be forced, not with the people behind them, not with the Turks thick on every side. A knot of mounted men turned northward, hunting for any thin patch in the ring. Another knot wheeled south. In the chaos, their movement looked less like strategy and more like a rush for daylight. Again, the rumor flashed through the ranks. They are leaving. They are leaving us. This time it did not need proof. The moment spread like fire in dry straw. The foot soldiers, seeing the only mounted hope peel away, began to break into smaller swarms, running toward whatever darkness looked least deadly. The pilgrims followed, because there was no other direction to go but after someone who seemed to know the way. The crusade dissolved into panic-struck fragments, each fragment chased by Turkish riders who knew the terrain like a second skin. The Turks did not need to hurry. They guided the collapse. They drove men toward ravines and cut them down in bunches. They herded fleeing groups into open ground where arrows could harvest them. When resistance stiffened, they pulled back, circled, and cut the edges off again. It was not just victory. It was a methodical unraveling of a force that had already lost its spine near the old camp. A final pocket held around the Welslom, and Germans stood shoulder to shoulder, too exhausted to run, too proud to kneel. They fought in silence now, breathing hard, eyes wide in the torchlight. Turkish riders swept close, calling for surrender. The defenders answered by raising blood-wet spears. The Turks answered by tightening the circle. Arrows fell, spears sagged. One by one the defenders folded to their knees. When the last man fell, the wells were still guarded by Turkish horses, and the water that had cost so much blood now belonged to the victors by the grey edge of dawn. The basin was a field of scattered humanity, not an army, not even a camp, just survivors in twos and tens, stumbling through scrub, pursued by riders who seemed tireless, and who carried cords for binding captives as often as they carried swords. Some Crusaders made it into the hills and hid among rocks, waiting for daylight to move again. Some were overtaken and cut down without a word. Others, too broken to run, dropped their weapons and knelt. Those were tied and herded together. A growing column of prisoners whose faces were blank with shock. The nobles who escaped did so in small knots on fresh horses, riding west without looking back, their breath tearing in their throats, their minds already shaping the story they would tell if they ever saw Europe again. In the dust behind them, the crusade that had come to rescue a prince and reach Jerusalem was being erased. When the sun finally rose over Mersivan, it rose on a Turkish victory so complete it felt unreal. The ridges were dotted with riders, their banners high, their lines intact. Below them the basin was silent except for the moans of the wounded and the call of crows. Already gathering, the Turkish commanders rode down into the field to take measure of what they had done. They walked among abandoned crosses and broken helms, among wagons split open like ribs, among bodies of men who had marched from Italy, France, and Germany believing themselves chosen. They did not jeer, they had no need to. The scale of the ruin spoke for them. Some chronicles say the dead were tens of thousands, others say fewer. In truth, numbers mattered less than the shape of the loss. This was not a battle where a wing collapsed or a rearguard was cut off. This was a crusade extinguished, a moving city of faith ground into dust by patience, terrain, and a plan that never once carelessly showed its hand. And yet, in the midst of victory, the Turks found what they had wanted from the beginning. Among the captives were high-born knights, men whose names could be ransomed for gold, for influence, for future restraint from Europe. The Danishments especially were hunting for a prize whose absence had drawn the Crusaders inland in the first place. Bohemond of Antioch was still in their grasp somewhere beyond these ridges, and now his value had doubled. Look what one captive prince could lure into a trap. Look what bargaining power his chains had brought. The day stretched. The prisoners were marched north under guard. The survivors who had fled into the hills clung to shade and prayed for night again. In the wrecked basin, Turkish riders began sorting spoils, weapons, armor, horses, relics, trophies that would be displayed in tents and courtyards from Sivas to Konya as proof that the cross could be broken, far to the west. A ragged handful of Crusaders reached the outskirts of Byzantine territory. They were hollow-eyed, walking skeletons in torn mail. They carried no banners now, only stories. Stories so terrible some listeners would refuse to believe them. But those stories had not yet reached Constantinople. Alexios did not yet know that. The road he feared had devoured another Latin tide. Europe did not yet know that its second rush toward Jerusalem had ended in a basin of blood it could barely pronounce. And in the east, the Turkish commanders were already asking the next question. That victory always opens. If one crusade could be destroyed this completely, what would happen when the next one came? They looked south, toward the lands the first crusade still held, toward Antioch, toward Edessa, toward Jerusalem itself. Their riders were eager. Their riders were eager. Their confidence was rising like heat off the plain. The crusade that never returned had died in Mersivan, but the war it was part of was not dying at all. It was only changing shape. Echoes of the lost crusade. Weeks later, in Constantinople, the first whispers arrived like smoke under a door. A fisherman on the Bosporus spoke of ragged Franks stumbling into coastal towns, skin clinging to bone, eyes scorched by something worse than sun. A merchant caravan west from Anatolia claimed he had seen fields littered with broken wagons and crosses, stretching farther than a man could walk in a day. Then a Byzantine outpost commander sent a sealed report to the palace. A handful of Crusader nobles had reached safety, not with triumph, but with terror. Alexios read their words in a chamber lined with mosaics of saints and emperors. Outside, the city buzzed as it always did, certain of its own endurers. Inside, the emperor felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had warned them. He had watched them choose the inner road anyway. Yet even he had not imagined a destruction this complete. The nobles who survived did not speak like victors. They spoke like men who had seen the end of a world they trusted. They described the ridges at Mersivan alive with riders, the arrows darkening the basin, the camp collapsing into screams, the night breakout that became a net. Some could not meet the emperor's eyes. Some blamed Lombard recklessness. Some blamed God's hidden will. None blamed themselves in quite the same way. But their trembling hands betrayed what their mouths refused to say. Alexios did not rage. He went quiet. Silence was his armor. If the Latin West had been shattered inland, then the Turks would swell with confidence again. The hard-won recovery of Western Anatolia, purchased by the First Crusade's passage, was now exposed to a new storm. He summoned his generals and spoke in the language of long wars. Fortify the passes, regarrison towns, watch the roads. Prepare to fight the Turks not as raiders but as masters of momentum. In another part of the city, the Latin survivors gathered in taverns and churches, licking their wounds, counting names, trying to decide how to tell Europe what had happened without drowning in shame. Some were already shaping their accounts into something less like collapse and more like martyrdom. They needed meaning. Without meaning, the dead were just dead. One morning, as a thin autumn rain turned the streets glossy, the emperor sent for them again. He offered ships south. He offered guides along the coastal road they had refused. He offered supplies that Byzantium could barely spare, not because he trusted them now, but because the stakes were too large for bitterness. Some survivors accepted and staggered onward. A shadow of a crusade, heading for Antioch or Jerusalem by the safer route. Most could not. They were sick, broken, penniless. They remained in Constantinople, or drifted homeward slowly, carrying the story of Mersivan like a hidden injury. North of the basin, the Danishman realm was celebrating a victory no one in Anatolia would forget. In their halls, prisoners were paraded, weapons were stacked in gleaming piles. Horses captured from Frankish knights were ridden in triumph through towns that had watched the Crusaders pass with dread, and in the center of that celebration sat the prize that had baited the trap. Bohemond of Antioch remained their captive. Word of the Crusades' annihilation raised his worth like gold in a furnace. Where once a ransom might have been negotiated with caution, now the Danishmends could name any price. They had proof of their power. They had broken a crusade with him, still in chains. Bohemond heard the news in his prison and understood the change instantly. The Latins had come for him and died. That meant two things at once. It meant he was a legend worth saving, and it meant the Turks had discovered the strength of their own method. When he was finally ransomed, it would not be because the Turks feared him. It would be because they had already used him. In Antioch, the Frankish princes of the East received survivors in stunned disbelief. Their castles still stood on Syrian hills. Their banners still flew above cities won by terrible sacrifice. Yet the stream of broken men coming from Anatolia was a warning from the land itself. The road to the west could not be taken for granted. The Turks had learned to kill Crusaders without sieges, without walls, without giving them the battlefield they wanted. Some leaders in the east tightened their grip on their own troops, drilling them in new tactics, hiring local scouts, learning from the cavalry warfare that had undone their brethren. Others looked at their fragile states and felt a cold dread. If the Turks turned south in full force, would Antioch survive? Would Jerusalem? For a time, the Turks did not press that advantage all the way, and they fought among themselves as rivals. Danishmends and Seljuks quarreled over cities, tribute, and pride. Victory had united them for one season. Ambition began to divide them again. Yet even in rivalry, their confidence had changed shape. The memory of Mersivan was now a weapon in every council. In Europe, the news arrived more slowly, carried by the few who had survived the return, their journey west as difficult as the march east had been. When the first testimonies reached the courts of France and Germany, they landed like a hammer blow. There had been no victory to sing, no relics brought home, no prince rescued, only a roll of dead names so long that churches had to read it over. Several Sundays, in some towns, nearly every family had sent a son or husband. Now the men were gone, and the women stood in doorways, staring at roads that would not bring them back. Yet, something strange happened, as grief met pride. The story of Mersivan did not kill the crusading spirit. It tempered it. Europe began to speak of Anatolia not as a road promised by God, but as a land that demanded careful conquest. Chroniclers wrote of the Turks not as scattered infidels waiting to be beaten, but as warriors who could bend a battlefield to their will. That change in imagination mattered. It meant the next crusade would not be led by pure faith alone. It would be led by kings. Years later, when another great crusading tide rose larger, richer, commanded by monarchs who had learned from the dead, the memory of Mersivan would move in the background like a ghost. The lesson was simple, carved by arrows into earth. Do not chase the enemy into empty land. Do not march with your lifeline cut. Do not believe numbers protect you if your unity is already gone. But there was a darker thread, too. The survivors of 1101 often spoke of the moment their nobles fled. Some said it was cowardice. Others said it was necessity, that without a living leadership there could be no future defense of the Holy Land. Both might be true. Yet the memory left a bruise in the common imagination of crusading Europe. Trust in princes, that fragile glue of medieval war, had been cracked. In Byzantium, too, Mersivan changed the calculus. Alexios became more cautious with Latin armies. He saw them now as a wildfire you might steer, but never fully control. The gap between Greek and Latin distrust widened. Every future cooperation would carry the stain of this catastrophe. If you step back and look at the shape of it, Mersivan was more than a battle. It was a burial of assumption. It buried the idea that crusading armies could drift through Anatolia on faith and chance. It buried the illusion that the Turks were a nuisance, rather than a strategic rival. And it buried tens of thousands of lives beneath a landscape that did not even keep their names. Yet history rarely closes its doors in silence. It leaves them ajar, because out of the dust of Mersivan came to rising forces with unfinished business. The Danishmends, emboldened, pushed their frontier toward the Byzantine heartlands. The Seljuks, nursing their own ambitions, looked for a way to reassert dominance over all Anatolia. Their rivalry would spill into new wars, new sieges, new alliances. In that chaos, the Crusader states in Syria would either find breathing room, or face a united Turkish counterstroke deeper and deadlier than anything yet seen and far away. In Western Europe, preachers began to speak again, not yet of a new crusade by name, but of unfinished vows, of Jerusalem still needing defenders, of the shame that could be washed only in another march. The road was being imagined again. The cross was being lifted again, not by the same men, those were bones in Anatolian soil, but by their sons, their brothers, their kings. So the story ends where it began, with a road and a question. After Mersivan, the world knew the Crusade. That never returned and died. But the idea of crusade, like a fire fed by grief and pride, was already finding new fuel. The Turks had learned how to destroy an army without letting it touch their walls. The Latins had learned that holiness did not guarantee survival. Two lessons, facing each other across the same brutal landscape, and somewhere beyond the sea, another army was already being dreamed into existence, step by careful step, heading toward the same Anatolian passes where the ground still remembered the sound of hooves in the dark.